I'm Krista Brady, and today I'll be talking to you about the axial skeleton. The axial skeleton makes up this long axis of the body, so it consists of the skull, the vertebral column, and the rib cage. So I've already talked to you about the skull in a previous video, so today I'm going to start with the vertebral column. This is a representative vertebra. The vertebra has several parts to it that you'll see on all vertebrae. So first you'll notice this big round part in the center. This is the centrum or body of the vertebra. And you do need to say body of the vertebra to specify what bone it's part of. And then you'll notice this little projection of bone that's going out to meet up with this part going off to the side here. So this little projection here is called the pedicle. The pedicle connects the centrum to the transverse process. So the transverse process is this part that is going out to the side, like this. Okay, and notice that there is one on either side. There's one on the left side and there's one on the right side. Okay, then you'll also notice, I'm going to turn this vertebra to the side so you can see this projection coming up here. So remember that the word for something that is up or higher than something else is superior. So this is the superior articular process. And it's going up to articulate with the vertebra right above it. Okay? And so if there's a superior articular process to articulate with the vertebra above it, there's probably also an inferior articular process to articulate with the vertebra below it as well. And then you'll notice that these form these little indentations as well. Remember that one of the words for an indentation in a bone is a notch, especially an indentation at the edge of a bone like this. So this one here on the superior side is the superior vertebral notch. And this one on the inferior side, which is much larger, is the inferior vertebral notch. So remember that with bones, we always want to orient ourselves in three directions, right? We want to orient ourselves anterior versus posterior, superior versus inferior, and medial versus lateral. Well, we don't have to worry about medial versus lateral with the vertebrae because they are located along the midline of the body, and there's just one of each particular vertebra. So this would be lined up right along the midline of your body in that vertebral column. And we now know things that can help us to distinguish anterior from posterior because this centrum or body, this is oriented towards the anterior of the bone. And then I'm going to turn this around so you can see the back better. So this projection coming out to the posterior here, this is the spinous process. And so that will help you also to distinguish anterior from posterior. And then since we talked about these superior and inferior articular processes and superior and inferior vertebral notches, those will help us to distinguish superior from inferior. As I mentioned, the inferior vertebral notch is much deeper than the superior vertebral notch. So that's a good hint there of which side is superior versus inferior. All right, let me point out a few other things on this. So I talked about the part of the bone that connects the centrum to the transverse process. Now, what about the part of the bone that connects the transverse process to the spinous process? This part right here is called the lamina. The lamina. And then we also have this big, huge hole right in the center here. That is the vertebral foramen. The vertebral foramen. What do you think would go through that vertebral foramen? If you said the spinal cord, then you're correct. Yeah, the spinal cord will be going through that vertebral foramen. If I have multiple vertebrae that are articulated together, then that vertebral foramen becomes the vertebral canal. So again, we use those words differently. The vertebral canal refers to this long hole when multiple vertebrae are articulated together. The vertebral foramen refers to that hole on just one vertebra. Okay, so a few things I want to point out on an articulated vertebral column like this, where the bones are connected together. One is you'll notice these pads in between each set of two vertebrae. These pads are called the intervertebral discs, and they connect the vertebrae, and they also provide for padding and cushioning there, so that as your vertebral column takes the stress of the weight of your body, it doesn't injure the bones themselves. Another thing that you'll notice is on the side here, there are all these holes where you can see these yellow things coming out. These yellow things represent spinal nerves, and those holes that they are coming out of are called the intervertebral foramina. So foramina, remember, is the plural of foramen. So one of these would be an intervertebral foramen. Inter means between, so these are between the vertebrae. All right, so we've talked about general features of vertebrae. Now there are three specific kinds of vertebrae. The cervical vertebrae, which you'll find in your cervical region. Remember, that's the neck region. The thoracic vertebrae, which are in the area of the thoracic region, which is the area that contains your heart and lungs. And then the lumbar vertebrae, which are much lower down in the lumbar region of your back. So let me point out how you can tell the differences between these. The cervical vertebra, the big giveaway here are these holes on either side, these holes in the transverse processes. These are called transverse foramina, singular transverse foramen, and this is where the vertebral arteries are going to go up, heading towards your head. And so that's the big giveaway, that this is a cervical vertebra, but there's a couple of other clues that you can also look at. The vertebral foramen here is going to be more triangular, and this spinous process, notice how it is split. We call that a bifid spinous process. Bi means two, and so a bifid spinous process has two little pieces coming out to either side. So those clues, the transverse foramina, the triangular vertebral foramen, and the bifid spinous process will help you tell that this is a cervical vertebra. Next, let's look at a thoracic vertebra. Okay, so the thoracic vertebra, notice that there are no transverse foramina. You just have the transverse processes that are solid coming out to the sides. And notice that the vertebral foramen is more circular. And then finally, the other clue that this is a thoracic vertebra is that it has this nice long spinous process that is pointing downwards, pointing inferiorly. So that's another clue that this is a thoracic vertebra. One other thing that will clue you in that this is a thoracic vertebra is the facets and demifacets where the ribs articulate. Thoracic vertebrae are the only ones that articulate with the ribs, and so they have these facets, which are flattened areas, where the ribs will articulate with them. So that's one more clue that this is a thoracic vertebra. Finally, the lumbar vertebra. A couple of things you'll notice. Lumbar vertebrae are typically the largest, but the last thoracic vertebra is pretty large as well. So you need some other clues to tell you that this is a lumbar vertebra. So one clue, look at the vertebral foramen. This is triangular again. So that's one clue for you. And also look at the spinous process, how it's very short and squared off like this. And then finally, if you look at the entire thing, notice how the little transverse processes, they look very short and stubby compared to the large centrum and the entire vertebra. So I think of this kind of like a T-Rex. It has little bitty arms pointing out that are not quite proportional to the rest of its body. So that is a lumbar vertebra. So there are two specific cervical vertebrae that you need to know that have their own names. This one is called Atlas. Atlas in Greek mythology was the Titan who held up the world. And so you can think of your head as the world. This vertebra, Atlas, is going to be holding up your head. So notice these flattened areas, these deep depressions here. This is where Atlas is going to articulate with the occipital condyles of the occipital bone. Also notice one thing that's interesting about Atlas is it does not have a centrum like most vertebrae do. So I'll show you what happened to that centrum. The second cervical vertebra is called axis, okay? And notice this projection that's coming up here. That projection is called the dens or odontoid process. And that is what was originally the centrum of atlas. It got transferred onto this second cervical vertebrae axis. So, atlas is the bone that allows you to nod your head yes, and axis is the bone that allows you to shake your head no. Okay, a couple other things I'll point out about axis. So it is a cervical vertebra, so it still has those transverse foramina, and it does have the typically the bifid spinous process. And then the big giveaway that this is axis is again that dens or odontoid process. One other important thing about these two bones. So there's a ligament that goes across that connects these parts of atlas here, and that helps keep these vertebrae in place. But in infants, that ligament is pretty weak. It's not fully developed. And so if you shake an infant, what is in that vertebral canal here that would be damaged by that? That's the spinal cord that's in there, right? And that's why you should never shake an infant. Next, let's talk about the sacrum. The sacrum is actually a bone that was originally 5 separate vertebrae, the sacral vertebrae, that then fused into this one bone, the sacrum. So a few things you should know about the sacrum. First of all, you'll probably notice these large holes. These holes are the sacral foramina, and you have holes on the front, the anterior sacral foramina. You also have holes on the posterior side, the posterior sacral foramina. So depending on which side you're looking at will determine what you call those. And how do you tell anterior from posterior? Well, the sacrum is curved towards the anterior. So this side here that shows that, that concave curve is the anterior side of the sacrum. Something else you'll notice is this rough surface on the side. This whole rough surface is where the sacrum is going to articulate with your hip bone, the os coxa. And somebody thought this looked like an ear-shaped area, so it is called the auricular surface of the sacrum. The auricular surface of the sacrum. And that's important to keep straight because it is auricular like ear, it is not articular. There is no T in that word. So that's something that students often mix up. Something else that I'll point out on here is that on this model, the sacral canal is not present, but in a real sacrum, you will have a hole that goes down through the sacrum called the sacral canal, and that is where the spinal nerves, the spinal nerves that come off of the end of the spinal cord are going to be going through that sacral canal. One other thing you should know about the sacrum is these processes that are coming up. These are the superior articular processes, and they are going to articulate with the last lumbar vertebra. Finally, one other thing on your lab list is the sacroiliac joint. And that's something that you can't see just on a sacrum alone because it is a joint, which is a place where two bones come together. The sacroiliac joint is this joint right here where the sacrum and the os coxa, your hip bone, come together. That's the sacroiliac joint. And then on this model of the sacrum, they've actually attached the coccyx right down here. So the coccyx is 4 or 5 fused little bones, and they just form this last little bit of the vertebral column. That's what you refer to as your tailbone. That's the coccyx. Now let's talk about the sternum. The sternum is this bone that's going to be right on the anterior of your thoracic cage. So it's right on the front of your chest. And it consists of 3 separate parts. This part up here that looks kind of like the knot of a tie. This is the manubrium. Manubrium actually means shield, so many people think it looks like a shield as well. So that's the manubrium. This main part of the sternum right here is called the body of the sternum, or the gladiolus. And then there's this little part at the bottom that actually, in people under 25, this is actually cartilage, and then it ossifies into bone after about the age of 25. This little part is called the xiphoid process. The xiphoid process. Okay, on the manubrium of the sternum, you'll notice some indentations. There's an indentation on each side. These are the clavicular notches where the clavicle, your collarbone, the clavicle is going to come and articulate. And then there's one more notch right in the center. This is called the jugular notch, also called the suprasternal notch, meaning above the sternum. And then finally, on this model, you'll notice these kind of tan-shaded translucent things. These are representing the costal cartilages, which are pieces of hyaline cartilage that are going to connect the sternum to the ribs. So those, again, are the costal cartilages. This is a rib. Okay, they're pretty distinctive. A couple things that you need to know about the ribs. So this part right here is called the head of the rib. This is where it's going to articulate with a thoracic vertebrae. And then just a little bit down from the head of the rib, you will notice this rough area. This is called the tubercle of the rib. That's actually another place where it's going to articulate with a thoracic vertebrae. So let me show you what this would look like if this is articulating with our thoracic vertebrae here. Notice the head is right up against the centrum of the vertebra, and then that tubercle is articulating with the transverse process of the vertebra right there. Okay, another part of the rib is this long, slender part here. This is called the shaft of the rib. The shaft of the rib. And that should do it for the rib. We have a few more bones in the axial skeleton that are just kind of miscellaneous bones. So one of these is the hyoid bone. This is this horseshoe-shaped bone, and this bone actually does not articulate with any other bones. It sits in your throat, right underneath the mandible, and is just connected by ligaments and muscles to the other bones. And it helps with things like swallowing. And one interesting fact about the hyoid is that if someone is strangled, the hyoid is typically broken. So when they're doing the crime scene investigation, that's one of the things they'll look for. Some other miscellaneous bones are these three tiny little bones here. They're collectively known as the auditory ossicles. In other words, these are the bones that help with hearing. So they're located in your middle ear, and they have specific names. This one here that looks like a mallet is called malleus. The one that looks kind of like an anvil is called incus. So malleus will actually hit incus in order to transmit vibrations. And then the last one that looks like a stirrup is called stapes. So once more, the auditory ossicles are malleus, incus, and stapes. The teeth, there are 32 teeth in the adult mouth. You have 8 on each side on the bottom and 8 on each side on the top. And your teeth are symmetrical, so we can look at just one half of the bottom and talk about these teeth, and then they'll have the same names on the right side of the mandible and on the right and left sides of the maxilla. Okay, so starting from the front, you have 2 sharp, rather flat teeth called incisors. These are the 2 incisors. The one that is most towards the midline here is the central incisor. And then we have the lateral incisor that is more to the side, more lateral. Moving right along, we have this sharp, pointy tooth that is the canine tooth. And there's just one canine tooth in each quarter of the mouth. Okay, then next we have the bicuspids. There are 2 bicuspids, also called premolars. So this is the first bicuspid or first premolar, and this is the second bicuspid or second premolar. And then we have the molars, and they are named just first, second, and third as you move farther back. So this is the first molar, this is the second molar, and then on this model, the third molar has been removed. It would be right back here. That third molar is what is commonly referred to as the wisdom tooth. And so, of course, most people have their wisdom teeth removed because there's not enough room in their jaw to accommodate it. Okay, so you have those same 8 teeth in each quarter of the mouth. So how do you distinguish which quarter those are in? Well, we're going to say upper or lower, depending on whether it is in the maxilla or the mandible. So for instance, this tooth right here would be the lower central incisor. And since this is on the left side, this would be the left lower incisor. Okay, this tooth here, so remember we have central incisor, lateral incisor, canine, and first premolar. So this would be the left lower first premolar. And then you would use the same naming strategy to name the other teeth. So if a tooth is in the right maxilla, it would be a right upper, and then whatever tooth it is. So let's say it's the first molar, it would be the right upper first molar. Okay, so that's the teeth. Okay, today we've talked about the axial skeleton. So I've shown you the vertebrae, including the different kinds of vertebrae. I've shown you the sacrum and the coccyx and the sternum. We've also talked about the ribs and the miscellaneous bones, the hyoid, the auditory ossicles, and the teeth. Now go ahead and practice these using the labeled and unlabeled images in the lab learning PowerPoints, and then you can apply these on the lab exercises.